What would you do if your own father told you not to come home after you'd quietly paid $2,000 a month to keep the lights on the water running and the fridge full for years? Stay with me because the moment my sister's boyfriend walked in, looked me in the eye, and said, "Hi, boss," everything changed. Elena Warren's mornings unfolded with the same quiet precision as a metronome's soft, rhythmic deliberate. Not because her life was dull, but because silence had become the most reliable form of peace she knew. Outside her apartment window, spring in Boston was still negotiating with winter. Thin shards of frost clung to the edges of the balcony railing, melting in hesitant streaks. The sidewalks below bore patchy reminders of yesterday's snow-frozen outlines of footsteps slush gathering in shallow dips. Elena stood barefoot in her kitchen, the tiles cool against her skin, and reached for the espresso machine. She measured a spoonful of dark roast, tamped it down with methodical care, and listened to the familiar hiss of water forcing its way through tightly packed grounds. The scent of coffee, sharp and earthy, filled the small room. From the corner radio, a soft jazz tune played Errol Garner's Misty, a song she used to study 2 years ago when dreams of lab coats and breakthrough trials kept her going through sleepless semesters, back when she still believed that success could translate into acceptance. She carried her espresso to the window and sat down. Her apartment overlooked a quiet street lined with old maples, just beginning to bud. The sun had started to climb, but the light was pale, diffused by a thin veil of clouds. Her life was stable, predictable, and terribly quiet. She had built something extraordinary, co-founding Novacura HealthTech, a biotech firm now on the brink of national recognition. Her work had been featured in 3 industry journals. A recent panel had even referred to her as a visionary in genomic diagnostics, but none of that mattered in the house she grew up in. To her parents, she was still just Elena, the quiet one, the serious one, the girl who didn't wear makeup to Christmas dinner and couldn't quite explain what she did for a living. Something in health or research, they would say with vague hand gestures. Her sister Rachel, on the other hand, charming, graceful, the polished face of the family, needed no introduction. Rachel had always been the favorite, the daughter with the sweet laugh and the right boyfriends, the kind of woman who made brunches feel like events. It had been nearly 3 years since Elena last went home. There had been no falling out, no official break, just a slow erosion of connection like an unused path gradually overtaken by weeds. No birthday calls, no holiday invitations, only silence stretched thin across time, like frost on a windshield, fragile, cold, and blinding. She had made peace with it, or so she thought. Her phone buzzed on the counter. The screen lit up Dad. Her stomach tightened. She reached for it, her thumb hovering over the green button. "Hi, Dad," she said, her voice steady but cautious. "Hey!" Elena, came the reply. Robert Warren's voice was calm, too calm. "I wanted to talk about this weekend." She smiled faintly. "I was just about to call. I cleared my schedule. I thought I'd drive up Friday night, help get things ready for Mom's birthday. Like always." A pause. Then another. "Elena," he said slowly, "maybe this year. You don't come home." She didn't move. Her hand rested on her espresso cup, the ceramic still warm. "I've already made arrangements," she said quietly. "It's not that," he added quickly. "It's just, well, Rachel is bringing Ethan, her new boyfriend." She waited. "He's a CFO now," Robert continued, "at a big firm, very polished, successful, the kind of man people notice." The silence in the room changed. It thickened, and Elena asked, though she already knew. "Well," he hesitated, "your job is hard to explain. Genetics, biotech. It's not really dinner conversation. We just don't want it to feel awkward for anyone." There it was. "So you're saying my presence would make the family look bad?" Her voice didn't rise, but something inside her did, something slow and raw. "That's not what I'm saying," he replied. "It's just, Rachel's easier to introduce. You've always been more private." The espresso tasted bitter now. She turned toward the window, her breath fogging the cold glass. "And if I come anyway?" There was no pause this time. "Then don't call me your father." Click. The call ended. Not with anger, not with yelling, just finality. Elena sat very still, the silence now pressing against her from every direction. She stared at the phone in her hand, its screen slowly dimming. Her reflection blinked back at her half-formed, hollow-eyed, more shadow than face. She didn't cry, didn't shout, didn't call anyone to ask why. She just sat there. Because something inside her had broken in such a quiet, precise way, it didn't even make a sound. She thought of the years she'd spent covering her parents' utility bills, electricity, water, internet, of the time her mother's car broke down and she wired money within the hour, of the quiet evenings spent alone while Rachel's Instagram lit up with family brunches and birthday toasts. Not once had they said thank you. Not once had they asked, "How are you holding up?" She had been their backup plan, their default solution, their silent fixer. And now she wasn't even invited. Her laugh came suddenly and startled even her. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't even sad. It was empty. Maybe the answer she had waited so long for had finally come, and it sounded a lot like silence. Long before silence became Elena's language, it was something she learned to sit quietly beside. As a child, she would press her forehead against the cool pane of her bedroom window, watching headlights trail across the front yard like fireflies on strings. Inside the house, laughter rose from the dining room, always around Rachel. Rachel was the kind of child who knew when to hug, when to giggle, when to beam, just enough to charm every adult in the room. Elena was the kind who sat with her crayons a little too long, who asked questions that made dinner guests blink. "She's just different," her mother Diane would say. Not cruelly, just conclusively. Elena once won a regional science fair when she was 12. She came home clutching a certificate and a crystal trophy, waiting for someone to ask how she built a bacterial culture that detected nitrate levels in water. Instead, her father patted her shoulder and said, "That's great, sweetie, but Rachel's ballet recital is tonight, don't forget." There had always been a hierarchy of visibility in the Warren household, though no one ever spoke of it aloud. Rachel sparkled. Elena held the spotlight steady for her. At school, Elena learned to disappear into lab work. In college, she stopped inviting her parents to research presentations because they always left early. "It's hard to follow," her mother would say, as if complexity were a flaw. Still, Elena kept hoping. She hoped when she bought her first car on a research grant. She hoped when she got into Johns Hopkins with a partial scholarship. She hoped the day she and 2 classmates walked out of a cramped biotech lab and decided to change the way rare diseases were diagnosed. But each milestone came and went, greeted with distant applause or none at all. There was a photo that haunted Elena more than any memory. It was taken on her mother's 60th birthday. The whole family had gathered in the garden. Rachel stood in the center, radiant in a red dress, one hand on her mother's shoulder, the other linked with her then-boyfriend, a dentist from Providence. Elena, in that picture, was half-turned slightly out of frame, her smile tentative. A cousin had posted it with the caption, "What a perfect family." Elena remembered reading it while standing in line for coffee, her chest tightening inexplicably. Not because of the words, but because in that frozen moment, she looked like a guest at her own family's life. She tried harder after that. She remembered one winter when Rachel lost her job and moved back in with their parents. Diane called Elena late at night. "Rachel's going through a lot," she said. "If you could help cover the mortgage for a while, we'd really appreciate it." Elena didn't hesitate. She sent the money quietly, no questions asked, month after month. When her colleagues questioned her long hours or late-night logins, she didn't explain. She didn't tell anyone she was paying for a home she wasn't welcome in. Maybe she believed that one day effort would translate into belonging. Maybe she thought that if she held everything together long enough, someone would notice she was holding it at all. After her father's call, Elena found herself pacing. She opened drawers she hadn't touched in months, photographs, letters, postcards she never sent. In one box, she found a worn notebook from college filled with goals written in tight, hopeful cursive. Get published in a journal. Start a company. Make Dad proud. She sat on the floor with the notebook open in her lap, the pages fragile, yellowing at the edges. The first 2 goals were long since crossed off. The third remained untouched. She stared at it for a long time. Then slowly, deliberately, she tore the page out and fed it to the fireplace. It caught fire with a soft hiss. She watched the flames consume the ink, curl the paper, and then disappear like breath fading on a mirror. The next morning, she stood before her bathroom mirror, brushing her hair into a low ponytail. Her reflection looked older than she remembered. Not tired exactly, but worn in the way things are when they've weathered too much without acknowledgement. She pressed her palm against the cool glass. "You don't have to earn being seen," she whispered to her own eyes. For years she had waited for an invitation back into a family that never truly welcomed her. She had learned to survive on scraps of recognition to water herself down in hopes of fitting better into someone else's mold. But maybe she wasn't made to fit. Maybe she was meant to stand apart, not as an exile, but as someone finally choosing herself. That evening, Elena received a message from a former mentor who had followed her career from afar. They'd seen an article featuring Novacura's latest research breakthrough. "I always knew you'd become the kind of woman people don't forget," it read. She stared at the message, then smiled. It was the smallest affirmation, yet somehow more sincere than anything she'd heard from her own family in years. She placed her phone on the table, closed her eyes, and breathed deeply. The quiet hadn't gone away, but it felt different now. For the first time in a long while, it wasn't empty. It was hers. It was just after midnight when Elena made the decision. The apartment was dark, except for the glow of her laptop. She sat, curled on the sofa, her knees pulled up to her chest, a wool blanket draped loosely over her shoulders. The fireplace flickered with its final embers. Outside, Boston's streets were silent, save for the occasional sigh of tires passing through half-melted snow. In the distance, a train horn cut through the stillness like a reminder of how easily things move on. On her screen, a tab was open, her bank's online dashboard. At the top, her name. Below it, months of outgoing transactions, each neatly labeled utility payment, Robert and Diane Warren, cable internet household transfer, repair services reimbursed to mother. She had never added up the total. Now she did.
90-day annual.
Elena stared at the number. Her eyes didn't sting, her chest didn't ache. It was a strange kind of numbness, the kind that doesn't ask for comfort, only clarity. They had never asked if she could afford it. When the water heater broke, her mother texted, "It's urgent, honey. Rachel's not working right now." When the fridge stopped running, "Just until your father's bonus comes in." She remembered every one of those messages. Not because they were manipulative, but because they were so matter-of-fact, as if she owed it, as if her role had never changed from silent provider to optional daughter. Her cursor hovered over the Manage Payments tab. One by one, she opened the accounts: electricity, water, gas, internet, even the streaming subscriptions. Cancel, cancel, cancel. Each click was a release. There was no sound, no cinematic music, just confirmation messages appearing in sequence. Auto payment canceled successfully. Account access removed. No future transactions scheduled. It wasn't vengeance. It wasn't a declaration. It was a severance. She leaned back and stared at the ceiling. The texture of the plaster looked like shifting clouds in the dim light. She had painted it herself after moving in an act of reclaiming space. She remembered choosing a pale, stormy gray because it reminded her of the sky before rain, honest, unsettled. She had tried to be the glue for a family that never noticed what she held together. She was always the first to arrive, the one who stayed late to clean up, the one who sent reminders for birthdays and booked the Airbnb when no one else bothered. They called it being dependable. But dependable in her family had become a quiet way of saying invisible. At 2:04 a.m., her phone lit up. It was a message from her mother. "Hi, sweetheart. Just checking in. Don't forget to pay the heating bill. The house feels like an icebox." Elena stared at the message. No mention of the call from earlier that day. No reference to her father telling her not to come home. Just a routine nudge, another invoice wrapped in feigned affection. She didn't respond. Instead, she typed out a draft. "Mom, Dad told me not to come to your birthday. He said if I insisted I shouldn't call him my father. So I won't. The bills are no longer mine to pay. If this feels inconvenient, maybe talk to the daughter you are proud to introduce." She paused, then deleted it. She wasn't angry. She was simply done trying to explain herself to people who only listened when they needed something. Later that morning, she woke to a series of new messages. From her father, "Water isn't running. Call the city for us, will you?" From Rachel, "Internet's down. Ethan's coming over tonight. Please sort this." From her mother, "Phone's acting weird. Can you fix the settings remotely?" Elena read them one by one as she brewed a fresh espresso. The aroma curled through the kitchen, comforting and clean. She didn't answer. She let the silence return, not the heavy kind from before, but a stillness that belonged to her now. Her phone buzzed again, a voicemail this time from Rachel. She listened on speaker. "You know what today is?" Her sister's voice snapped. "Mom's birthday. We have people coming over. Ethan's meeting everyone. And now we have no Wi-Fi, no heat, no water, and Mom's crying. All because you're sulking. You've always been selfish, Elena." Elena stared out the window. The sun had risen fully. The maples out front shimmered with early buds. A neighbor's dog barked somewhere in the distance. Selfish. She whispered the word as if tasting it for the first time. She had never been selfish. She had bent over backward for years, quietly cleaning the messes others made. She had absorbed their guilt, buffered their outbursts, stayed small so others could shine. And now for once she had chosen herself. And somehow that was selfish. No, this was sanity. She sat on the couch and opened her laptop again. Not to pay a bill, but to review a list of personnel transfers for Nova Cura's Boston headquarters. A familiar name caught her eye: Ethan Prescott. The man Rachel was now parading around as her perfect match. Her cursor hovered over the file. "Head of Finance New Jersey Division requesting transfer to Boston HQ." Approval required Elena Warren. A slow, disbelieving smile crept across her lips. She clicked open. The photo attached to his profile was polished, confident, exactly the kind of man her parents would gloat about at dinner parties. She remembered shaking his hand months ago at a conference. He had addressed her politely, professionally, co-founder Warren. He'd said clearly unaware of her last name's connection to his girlfriend. She hadn't cared then, but now she understood life had its own sense of irony. And sometimes it handed you the truth without lifting a finger. Elena didn't mark the day on her calendar. She didn't set a reminder or write a card. When her mother's birthday arrived, it came and went like any other morning, calm, unremarkable, and quiet. At 9:06 a.m., her phone buzzed. "Mom, sweetheart, I think the power's out. Could you check the account for us? It's a special day." Elena didn't answer. She was seated on her small balcony with a mug of peppermint tea, a blanket tucked around her legs, watching the city slowly stir to life beneath an overcast sky. The clouds hung low as if holding their breath. 10 minutes later, "Dad, still no power. And the water's not working either. Is there a problem with the payments? Call the provider." Short, impersonal. No good morning. No acknowledgement of what had passed between them just days earlier. No mention of the words he'd said. "Then don't call me your father." Just a command as if nothing had happened. As if she were still the family's behind-the-scenes operator, a technician, not a daughter. Elena let the message sit unread. By noon, the house was unraveling. Rachel's first message came in loud and dramatic. "Mom's near tears. Guests are coming soon and there's no Wi-Fi." "What's going on, Elena?" A second message minutes later. "The thermostat isn't working either. Seriously, you need to step up right now. This is important." Elena closed her phone and placed it face down beside her tea. No anger stirred, no vindication bubbled, only quiet. Inside the Warren home, chaos simmered beneath porcelain platters and decorative candles. The living room was dressed to impress. Rachel had arranged fresh flowers, coordinated the napkins, even printed menus. But the kitchen was frigid. The lights refused to turn on. The oven wouldn't start. The faucet sputtered like a choked breath. Diane, in a soft pink blouse, paced back and forth, murmuring to herself. The power should have been taken care of. Elena always. Robert sat by the window, scrolling through his phone, frustration tightening his jaw. Rachel was in the middle of the dining room, phone in hand, glaring at the blinking no-signal icon. "I swear she's doing this on purpose," she muttered. At 2:43 p.m., the first knock came. Ethan stood at the door with a bottle of wine, his suit sharp and smile polite. When Rachel ushered him inside, he immediately noticed the cold. "There's been a little issue," she said, breezily. "Just a technical hiccup. Elena's usually the one who..." She stopped herself. "Anyway, come in." Ethan looked around the dim hallway. "You mean your sister?" Rachel nodded, expression stiff. "She's not here." "Couldn't make it," Rachel replied. "Busy with work. You know how she is." Ethan didn't answer. In Elena's apartment, the afternoon light had begun to fade. She sat at her desk reviewing personnel updates when her phone buzzed again. Aunt Sharon, her mother's older sister, the only relative who still sent birthday texts and Christmas cards, though Elena rarely replied. It wasn't a message this time. It was a video call. Elena stared at the screen, uncertain. Then on a strange instinct, she answered. Sharon's face appeared, lit only by the pale glow of her phone's flashlight. Behind her, voices echoed the indistinct murmur of people trying not to panic. "Elena," she said gently, "your mom's in a full panic. Nothing's working. They're scrambling to keep the guests calm. I don't know what happened, but I think I'm starting to understand why you're not here." Elena didn't speak. Sharon didn't push. After a pause, she asked, "Is there something you want me to know?" Elena drew a long breath, slow and even. "Dad told me not to come," she said quietly. "Said I made the family look bad. Told me if I insisted I shouldn't call him my father." Sharon's face changed, the gentle lines hardening into something close to anger, or maybe just clarity. "I had no idea," she said. "They never said a word. They just told everyone you were busy." Before Elena could reply, there was a commotion behind Sharon. Voices, movement, and then suddenly Ethan appeared in the frame. He blinked in confusion. "Nicole," his voice was sharp with recognition. "You're..." Sharon stepped aside instinctively. The camera shifted. Rachel's voice rose from behind. "Who is it?" Ethan stared into the camera, stunned. "Elena Warren," he said aloud. "She's my direct superior, the co-founder of Novacura." The room behind him fell silent. No one moved, no one spoke. Rachel stepped into view, frozen, her mouth slightly open. Robert looked like he'd been struck. Diane sat heavily in the nearby chair, her hands trembling around a teacup. Elena didn't flinch. She met Ethan's gaze and said with a soft, composed voice, "I hope your introduction to the family is going well." Then she ended the call. For a long moment afterward, Elena didn't move. She sat in the quiet, breathing in the stillness like oxygen. No joy surged through her, no rush of triumph. Just a kind of solemn peace. The truth had spoken, and for once, not through her. Elena didn't check her phone for hours after ending the call. She didn't need to. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, shifting with the weight of a truth that had finally landed. By the time dusk had settled into her apartment and the city lights had begun to flicker awake, the messages started pouring in. First from Rachel. You knew. You knew all along, and you let it happen right in front of everyone. Ethan was shocked. Mom cried. You ruined everything. It was long, rambling, a threadbare attempt to weave guilt and panic into something resembling control. Elena didn't respond. Instead, she made herself a cup of ginger tea and settled into her couch, letting the heat from the ceramics seep into her fingers. Outside, the last light of day melted behind rooftops. Inside, all was still. 10 minutes passed. Another message. Don't you think that was cruel? Elena stared at the screen, then slowly opened a new message window. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before she began to type. You say I was cruel, but I was just at home. I didn't start the video call. I didn't call myself his boss. I didn't announce anything. I said nothing. The truth did all the speaking. And if one truth was enough to ruin the entire celebration, maybe it wasn't built on much to begin with. She sent it. Not to justify, not to retaliate, but to close the loop. To show that she was no longer playing a role in a narrative she didn't write. Later that night, a new message appeared. This one from her mother. I never expected you to get back at the family like this. You've changed. Elena read it 3 times. Then she locked her phone and placed it face down on the counter. It wasn't fury that rose inside her. It was understanding, cold and clean. They didn't see her decision as a boundary. They saw it as betrayal. Not because she had lashed out, but because she had stopped participating. Around 10 p.m., an email arrived from Ethan. The subject line was quiet but direct. Apology and goodbye. She clicked it open. Elena, I couldn't sleep. I've been thinking about what happened, about what I didn't know, what I should have noticed. I'm sorry I didn't see the truth sooner. Not just about who you are professionally, but who you are beyond that, the way you carried yourself, the calm, the integrity. I'm not ashamed that you're Rachel's sister. I'm ashamed I didn't see her clearly until tonight. I ended things with her. I can't be part of something that lacks basic respect. You didn't say a word, and somehow that made everything louder. Thank you for your silence, for your grace, and for leading the way you do. Ethan. Elena leaned back, the email open on her screen, her hands still. She didn't feel triumph. She didn't feel pity. She felt seen. For the first time in years, someone had looked past the surface and recognized her not for what she did, but for how she did it. She crafted her reply slowly. Ethan, you don't owe me an apology. Everyone is responsible for how they choose to see others and how long they choose to look away. I never bring personal matters into work. But I'm glad you understand now. Sometimes silence is the loudest way to stand your ground. Elena. She hit send, then closed her laptop, stood from her desk, and walked to the window. Outside, the street was quiet, washed in gold from the overhead lamps. Somewhere, a car door shut. A siren cried faintly in the distance. She folded her arms and leaned into the frame, the glass cool against her skin. She had said almost nothing that day. But still, everything had changed. It was a Sunday. A rare one. The kind where Elena allowed herself to unplug. No laptop, no meetings, no silent obligations. She had just settled into the couch with a paperback and a soft fleece throw when the doorbell rang. At first she thought it was a delivery, but when she glanced through the peephole, her breath caught. Her parents stood at the door. Robert in his usual navy windbreaker, arms crossed. Diane beside him, clutching a small paper bag, eyes rimmed with weariness. Neither of them looked angry. Just aged. Tired in a way she hadn't remembered. She didn't move at first. Then slowly she opened the door. Hi, honey, Diane said, her voice tentative. We were hoping we could come in. Talk, just a bit. Elena stepped aside without a word. No hugs, no warm greetings, just footsteps on hardwood and the creak of old wounds returning to the room. She poured water, set down 2 glasses, and took a seat across from them in the living room. The silence was heavy, but no longer frightening. It was simply familiar. Robert cleared his throat. About your mom's birthday. I said things I shouldn't have. Elena didn't respond. She just watched him. He looked at her, then down at his glass. Maybe we've been a little hard on you. Rachel's been a wreck since the breakup. Your mother's been crying nonstop. So we wanted to talk. Diane jumped in quickly, setting the bag on the table. We actually brought something, a proposal of sorts. Elena raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Her mother pulled out a single printed sheet, a spreadsheet. Monthly figures, expenses, insurance premiums, living costs. "You're stable now," she said gently. "Your job is doing well. We thought maybe you could help. Just a little. $2,000 a month to keep things running smoothly." Elena stared at the paper. $2,000 each month. "Like clockwork," Robert added. "It's not much for someone in your position. It's just family, Elena." She sat up straighter. "And Rachel," Diane hesitated. "She's not doing well. The breakup's been hard. Work hasn't panned out. We can't pressure her right now." Elena's laugh was soft, not bitter, just disbelieving. "Rachel's never been pressured." She met their eyes, her voice level. "I have a counterproposal." She slid the spreadsheet back across the table. "If Rachel agrees to contribute her part, $1,000, and if you both agree to sign a legal contract stating that when you pass all remaining assets, including the house, go to me, I'll consider it." The room went still. Her father's face flushed red. "Are you seriously giving us conditions?" Elena didn't blink. "Not conditions," she said, "principles. I've already given nearly $20,000 to this family in silence. No one acknowledged it. If I'm going to keep giving it won't be out of guilt. It'll be on my terms." Diane turned to Robert, her voice low, almost pleading. "Maybe we should just—" But Robert stood slamming his hand on the table. "We raised you for over 20 years, and now you want a contract. You want to put a price on that." Elena stood too, calm, steady. "If raising me was an investment, and this is the return you expect, we can calculate it line by line." She looked between them. "But I won't pay for it with silence anymore." They didn't say goodbye when they left. No parting hug, no forced smile, just the click of the door as it closed behind them and the slow fade of footsteps down the hall. Elena didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She simply stood at the window watching their figures shrink into the early evening haze. She hadn't drawn a line out of anger. She had drawn it to survive. They never called again. Not to protest the terms, not to renegotiate, not even to apologize for the way Robert's voice had cracked the air in her living room, loud and self-righteous, as though love could be leveraged into a debt. Elena didn't expect otherwise. She knew the silence that followed wasn't born of shame or remorse. It came from people who no longer knew how to speak when they weren't in control. Days passed, then weeks. She kept showing up to the office, reviewing quarterly reports, pitching a new diagnostic pilot to investors. Her days were full but not frantic, her nights peaceful in a way that once felt impossible. She no longer checked her phone with a knot in her stomach. No more hovering over messages filled with passive-aggressive guilt. No more waiting for an apology that never came. She didn't even notice at first that she'd taken down the old family photo from her desk. The frame had been there so long its absence looked like light. It was during a Thursday afternoon team huddle that Ethan stepped into the conference room. He carried a folder, his voice calm and measured, discussing projected returns and revised budgets. There was no hesitation in his tone, no glances over his shoulder. He called her Ms. Warren in front of the board, and not once, not ever did he mention Rachel again. They worked together now with a kind of quiet professionalism that didn't pretend the past hadn't happened, but also didn't weaponize it. Elena appreciated that. Some truths once acknowledged needed no retelling. One afternoon, as rain drizzled outside the office windows, Elena stopped by a neighborhood cafe she hadn't visited in years. It was the kind of place that felt more like a nook than a shop hand-painted mugs, old jazz records stacked behind the counter, and light that filtered through tall windows like something sacred. She ordered a latte and sat by the window. Outside, people moved beneath umbrellas, faceless and hurried. Inside, everything felt still. On the wall near her table, carved into a piece of driftwood, were words she hadn't noticed before. Home is not always a place. Sometimes it's a choice. She stared at the sign for a long time, fingers wrapped around the warmth of her cup. She thought about the version of herself who used to cling to duty in the hope it would become love, who used to pay bills and bury needs hoping to be welcomed in return, who used to sit on the edges of family portraits, trying not to ruin the frame. She wasn't that version anymore. She wasn't seeking entry. She had built something of her own, a home not defined by addresses or approval, but by stillness, safety, and space to breathe. Later that evening, as she walked home beneath a canopy of low gray clouds, she noticed how light her body felt. There was no weight she hadn't chosen to carry, no role she hadn't consented to play. And for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of being seen not for who her family wanted her to be, but for who she truly was. Not the backup, not the fixer, not the shadow, just Elena. A woman who had survived neglect disguised as tradition. A daughter who had stopped auditioning for acceptance. and a person who had finally come home not to a house but to herself. Spring came quietly. One morning, the trees lining Elena's street bloomed without ceremony. Pale pink blossoms fluttered in the breeze like soft applause, not loud, not for anyone in particular, just present. Life had settled into a new kind of stillness. Not the stillness of suppression, but one of calm conviction. Elena no longer wondered if the phone would ring. It didn't. She no longer hovered over texts laced with guilt. There were none. And in that silence, she found peace. One afternoon during a budget review meeting, Ethan walked in carrying an updated investment forecast. He handed her the folder with his usual composed professionalism. They hadn't spoken about Rachel since the video call. Not once. And that silence, respectful, unintrusive, was a kind of grace Elena deeply valued. As he left the room, she caught a glimpse of something in his expression. Not regret, not sadness, just quiet understanding. Some truths, when finally seen, don't need retelling. Later that evening, rain streaked softly against her apartment windows. Elena stopped by her favorite cafe, the one with carved wood beams and handwritten menus, and chose a table by the window. The same carved sign hung above the bookshelf. Home is not always a place. Sometimes it's a choice. She ordered a cappuccino this time. No longer espresso, something warmer, gentler. A small change, but intentional. As she sipped, she thought back to the version of herself that had waited. Waited for validation. Waited to be asked how she was. Waited for someone, anyone in her family, to see her, not as the one who pays the bills or explains away the hard things, but as a whole person. That version of her had loved deeply, hoped quietly, and endured without question. But that version no longer lived here. Now Elena didn't define herself by how much she could carry, or how quietly. She defined herself by what she chose to no longer hold. Weeks passed. Then, one Sunday during her weekly team debrief, Marcus, one of Novacura's co-founders, placed a hand on her shoulder after the call ended. "You've been different lately," he said with a soft smile. "Lighter." Elena didn't deny it. "I stopped waiting," she said. "For what?" "For them to come around. For them to explain. To ask. To see me." Marcus nodded. "You did the right thing. You just let the truth speak." She returned the smile, not forced, not automatic, but real. That night, as she prepared for bed, she caught her reflection in the mirror. There were no dramatic changes. Same face, same eyes. But there was something steadier in the way she looked back at herself, like she no longer needed permission to exist fully. She didn't check her phone before sleeping. She didn't wonder if her mother would ever text again. She knew now the apology may never come, and that was okay. Because she wasn't waiting. Not for their words. Not for their approval. And not for the past to become what it never was. In the final pages of an old journal, she wrote just one line: "I didn't get revenge. I remembered who I was and stopped asking them to." She folded the book shut, placed it gently on her shelf, and turned off the light. Outside, the wind carried petals across the sidewalk like confetti from an invisible celebration. And in the stillness of her room, Elena smiled, because the silence no longer asked her to suffer. It simply let her be.